It's the disembodied voice, back for another test review. Art history veterans have heard a lot of these. The short answer question for this unit will ask about the consequences of the plague. The word consequences offers a big hint that this is a causation question. What changes did the plague cause? The plague's a hot topic for the College Board. Here are some stimulus prompts that have shown up recently, and I think mostly appear in your stimulus package. And here are some other College Board prompts about diseases. The Justinian plague that pretty much ensured that Justinian's successors would be unable to hang on to the Western Roman Empire that his generals had reconquered. The measles and smallpox epidemics that wiped out as much as 90% of the native population of the Americas. And the flu epidemic of 1918-1919 that actually killed a lot more people than World War I did. So short answer questions do not require you to demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of historical reasoning skills. Follow the ACE model. But since you could easily get a similar topic for a DBQ or an LEQ, let me just remind you quickly of the tricks to causation questions. So here's the McConnell version, which you've seen before, the questions you should ask when you get a causation question. Here's a quick summary of common causation errors. And here's the wordier College Board version with my underlines. One important addition here is that the College Board emphasizes a difference between short and long-term effects, and that's actually important for this topic, although again, it's probably more detail than you'll need for the short answer question. So I first wrote this podcast for a longer in-class lecture, which included clips from a very good BBC documentary on the Black Death. Amazingly, that still seems to be up on YouTube, and the link and video sheet are both up on Moodle if you'd like to know more. As it happens, we have a fair number of eyewitness accounts of the plague. Here's one of the most famous from the Renaissance author of the Decameron, who was in fact an eyewitness in Florence, one of the cities hardest hit by the Black Plague. So think about what this quotation says about what happened to social and family ties and rules of behavior. I'm not going to read it out loud. Similarly, what point might this Florentine painter be making? So who's stricken by the plague in this painting, and what's their rank? Well, this was a disease that killed everybody. So it also significantly undermined family ties and social hierarchy in a society that rested very much on both of these. So what about the plague's impact on religion, which of course was another great binding force of the High Middle Ages? Obviously, there were no photographers around in 1347. Many of the visual records we have come from illuminated manuscripts or hand-copied and illustrated books. So what is happening in this scene from an illuminated manuscript? We see a priest administering last rites to the plague victims. The red spots are the buboes, or swollen lymph nodes, one of the plague's major symptoms. In times of crisis, people turned to the church for explanations and for help. The 1300s were a deeply religious time. The High Middle Ages, usually described as the 1200s, had witnessed the construction of magnificent Gothic cathedrals, the emergence of great Catholic universities and major urban centers such as Paris, and the creation of new monastic orders such as the Franciscans and Dominicans, who preached to large multitudes in the cities. The church owned a huge amount of property, and they ran many businesses. So, for example, double-entry bookkeeping was probably invented by a Franciscan monk. The church also ran virtually all schools and hospitals. So, when half the population dropped dead in a very short period of time, what do you think happened to people's religious faith? Do we get any clues from Boccaccio's account? Well, according to Boccaccio, people abandoned morals and did as they pleased. Family members abandoned each other. Many buried their fears in alcohol and partying. The death rate among the clergy was at least as high as in the general population, and often it was higher. We know, for example, that in Montpellier, France, only 7 of 140 Dominican friars survived. In Avignon, where the Pope was living, remember the Babylonian captivity? This is a time when the papacy was divided. 1/3 of the cardinals died, and the death rate among the rest of the clergy was over 50%. And so here's a question. Which priests, monks, and nuns were most likely to die from the Black Death? Well, this is an incredibly contagious disease. So the people who were most likely to die were the people who did not abandon their responsibilities and hide from the sick. In other words, the church lost a lot of its most heroic and dedicated leaders. By the way, the person on the right is Saint Bernardine, who was, when he was just 20 years old, walked into the plague hospital in Siena and took charge because the doctors and monks had fled. He survived the plague, he became a monk himself, and then a leader of the church. But an awful lot of heroic priests, monks, and nuns died serving the sick. So what do you think happened to the church when huge numbers of clergy died? Again, we see a complicated chain of causation. Basically, the church faced a huge employment crisis. New men did enter the priesthood, but are very critical of the new recruits. So here's one comment by an English clergyman. So why does he think these men were entering the priesthood? Men who had lost their families, who were lonely, turned to the church to find new meaning in their lives. This document suggests another motive. What is it? Well, the wealth of the church was attracting new recruits. So why might the church have been getting wealthier in this period? People had long given money to the church to try to atone for their sins. And didn't the plague mean that God was angry at sin? The huge death rate also meant that some people died without heirs, and their money often went to the church as well. Most of the sources we have on the problems within the church are church sources. These were the people who could read and write. It's pretty clear from historical sources that surviving church leaders were very worried about the kind of men who are now joining the priesthood. So let's move away from the priesthood for a minute and talk about the reaction of ordinary believers. Again, remember that this was a very religious age. We know from Boccaccio's account that some people decided just to live for the moment and forget about any last judgment. But if the plague did not shake a person's belief in God, what other religious conclusion might a person living through the plague come to? Well, maybe God was punishing the people of Europe for their sins. So what's happening in this picture? If you have time to watch a video clip from the BBC documentary, this is an especially good one. These are flagellants who walked through towns, beating themselves, torturing themselves, essentially to expiate their sins. So why did the flagellant movement, quote, send shockwaves through the church, unquote? I'm quoting a historical source. Weren't these just especially devout Christians? Well, in fact, the Pope originally supported flagellation as an act of penance, but as the movement grew more organized, it also became a direct challenge to the church. In some places, especially in Germany, leaders of the flagellant brotherhood started denying the powers of the sacraments. They claimed that the flagellant brotherhood's authority superseded that of the Pope. And yes, the flagellants were a little crazy. Each member of the flagellant brotherhood, for example, vowed never to bathe, shave, sleep in a bed, change clothing, or converse in any way with members of the opposite sex. It's kind of amazing that they attracted a crowd. The smell must have been interesting. Anyway, in mid-1349, Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull denouncing the flagellants as heretics because they formed unauthorized associations, adopted their own uniforms, and wrote their own church statutes. Basically, we are seeing the unquestioned authority of the church break down. Again, it wasn't helped by the fact that the papacy itself was divided, but we see the beginnings of movements that will eventually culminate in the Protestant Reformation. So now we look at another reaction to the plague. What do you think's happening in this picture? The video includes an eyewitness account of a Jewish woman being, quote, put to the question, unquote. As you might guess, that means tortured, and of course it wasn't just reserved for Jews. Confession did not usually save the person confessing, but it might replace the torture with a faster death. It seems pretty clear from a lot of historical evidence at the time that the plague stirred up anti-Jewish sentiments. People were frightened, and it was easier to believe that some evil persons were causing the plague than to see it as a calamity that could neither be explained nor stopped. Evil persons, at least, you could find and punish. But, and this is one of these are there other causes questions, were fear and prejudice the only reason that there was an uptick in the torture and murder of Jews? Is there another reason? Why else might they have been singled out for punishment? Again, remember you want to look for other possible causes. So here's a list of just some of the actions that English and French kings took against Jews in the century before the plague hit Europe in 1347. So what might have been their motives? Again, if you have time, the next video clip suggests an answer. European Christians were suspicious, yes, of people who did not accept their religion, and many probably really did believe that Jews were poisoning wells or feasting on Christian babies or calling up Satan to bring on the plague. But there was also something else going on. At this time, the church did not permit Christians to lend money at interest, which was called the sin of usury. People, however, still needed to borrow money when they got into financial trouble, or they wanted to invest in land or a business, or they needed money to go on a crusade. So they turned to the Jews, whose religion did not forbid money lending. In most European countries, moreover, it was illegal for Jews to own land. So in a highly agricultural economy, the Jews did not have a lot of choices about professions, and many went into money lending, or what we would today call banking. Now, a good argument can be made that the persecution of the Jews were motivated by greed as well as fear and superstition. And by the way, there's no reason why both of these explanations can't be right. Remember, the College Board worries about having a single simple explanation, and remember the single cause fallacy? At any rate, nobles and kings borrowed especially heavily from the Jews when they wanted to go on crusades. Killing or expelling the Jews was a rather easy and convenient way to get out of paying back. By the way, another profession that many Jews entered was medicine. Although Jews made up less than 1% of the overall population of Europe and only 5 to 8% of the population in large cities, they were disproportionately educated and literate. Documents from the time suggest that 50% or more of doctors in many major cities were Jewish. We know, for example, that in the late 1200s, Pope Nicholas IV's doctor was Jewish. So what would you guess happened to Jewish doctors during the plague? Well, a lot of them died, and of course a lot of them came under suspicion. Note the church did not support these massacres. Clement VI doesn't show up on many lists of great popes. In his own words, he, quote, lived as a sinner among sinners, unquote. In other words, he loved a good party, and he spent a whole lot of money on his own pleasure. But to his credit, he did try rather hard, if without much success, to stop the persecution and killing of the Jews. But even his motives may have been complicated. This was a period when popes were having a lot of fights with kings, and it was kings rather than popes who owed money to the Jews. So maybe popes didn't want to see the kings or nobles let off easily. My point here is it's not as easy as it seems at first glance to understand why the plague led to the massacres of Jews, or even why the Pope defended the Jews. Cause and effect arguments are notoriously complicated. And by the way, if you can just indicate a little understanding of that complexity to the College Board, your essay is going to stand out in comparison with students who take a more simplistic approach to their analysis. But since we're asking you to look at causation, I'm going to move on anyway to economic changes that seem to have been caused at least partly by the plague. These are really important and will have long-term effects. You're talking about short-term versus long-term. This is an important long-term effect. So when the plague attacked Europe in the 1340s, most people were serfs, peasants who were required to stay on a specific piece of land and serve their lords for a set wage. And usually that wage was established by some kind of feudal charter. The social gap between peasants and nobles was very wide, and it was also highly regulated by law. So what does this chart suggest happened to at least some of these legal arrangements after the plague? Look at the two lines, the blue and the green line, and what they're showing. Note that real wages means what a wage will actually buy. In other words, it adjusts for changes in price. So suppose your wage was $10 an hour yesterday and an average meal cost $10. 1 hour of work would earn you 1 meal. If the price of the meal, same meal, fell to $5 and your hourly wage stayed the same at $10, your real wage, what you could buy with your money, would increase pretty substantially. And that's what that term means. It's basically adjusting for inflation. So with a decline in the number of available workers, the workers who were left could demand higher wages, and they did. How would you guess the nobility responded? They were not pleased. In 1351, Edward III of England instituted the Statute of Laborers, which made it illegal for employers to pay more than the traditional wage rate, required all laborers to accept those wages, and made it illegal for serfs to leave the land to which they were bound. In 1363, the British Parliament passed a sumptuary law, basically saying peasants have to keep looking like peasants. It restricted the quality and color of cloth that peasants and town dwellers, that is, non-nobility, could buy, and tried to limit the food they could buy to basic non-luxury items. In 1378, a wealthy landowner wrote, "Laborers of olden times were not accustomed to eat wheat bread. Their drink was water, clothing was plain gray. Then was the world of such." Well, the efforts to keep the peasants down did not work very well. They were both shattered by the plague and emboldened by the fact that there were fewer of them and they could ask for more money. So in 1381, the English peasants revolted against these laws. This is, by the way, an important political consequences. And by the way, there was a new poll tax, which was to pay for the expensive wars with France. So Wat Tyler, a peasant, led 60,000 peasants on a march to London to present a petition to the king. The petition called for abolishing serfdom. That's a radical demand. So here is a contemporary illustration of the conflict. The young English king, Richard II, courageously met with the peasants. The Lord Mayor of London ordered Tyler killed. That's what you see here. But the king persuaded the peasants to disperse. He promised to meet some of their demands. Further protests were put down by the army, and most of the promises the king chose not to keep. There was a similar peasant revolt, or jacquerie, that is a revolt of the jacques, or the ordinary people, in France in 1358. By the way, peasant revolts are another topic that often shows up in College Board questions. And not only in Europe, but perhaps even more in China. And interestingly, there was a major peasant revolt in China at just about the same time. China was also hard hit by the plague, and it was part of a number of different political changes that led to the downfall of the Yuan dynasty and the rise of the Ming dynasty. Anyway, back to Europe. The peasants in France were objecting to new taxes imposed by their noble landlords and the king, and this was to pay for the same wars, this time, of course, with England. It didn't help that the French kept losing battles. This was before Joan of Arc. But the peasants' defeat did not change the profound economic effects of the plague or the growing bargaining power of peasants. Let me just mention a few other economic consequences. The employment of children increased. That's what happens when there's a labor shortage. With skilled labor in short supply, women could find employment in jobs that had once been the preserve of men: smiths, tanners, carpenters, and tilers. Abandoned crop fields were turned into pasture land for sheep, and landlords let any family willing to work a farm move in and do so for free rather than the land go to waste or be reclaimed by the forest. So many peasants became small land owners during this time, and there was a substantial shift in agricultural focus to pastoral, particularly sheep raising for wool. That was especially important in England. Finally, and I think I probably talked about this back in art history, in Italy, the plague helped bring about the Renaissance in kind of an odd way. With many, many people dying, newcomers inherited large fortunes. A third cousin might suddenly become rich. And one interesting effect of this was to bring new families into economic and political power. An example of this for the Medici family. And with their new wealth came a willingness to experiment, to support new kinds of artists. So in some ways, shaking up the old world did in fact help bring in the new. Let's end by leaving Europe and traveling to Asia. This is the last of your 5-part question. So the effects of the Black Death in Asia are not as well documented. We don't have as many records, or they may not have been made available to Western scholars. But what do you notice just looking at this map about how the Black Death traveled in Asia? You should recognize those lines. On the north, we see the Silk Road, and on the south, the blue lines, we see the Indian Ocean trade routes. As the plague moved along these trade routes, it disrupted the trade and undermined the economic advances that Pax Mongolica had brought. But probably the most significant impact that the Black Death had on Asia was that it contributed to the fall of the Mongol Empire. The massive population loss, I need to change my slide, and terror caused by the plague destabilized all 4 of the Mongol Khanates. They're shown here. The Mongol ruler of the Ilkhanate Empire in the Middle East, for example, not only did he die of the disease, but all 6 of his sons died as well, or 6 of his sons died as well. So, although the Pax Mongolica had allowed increased wealth and cultural exchange through the reopening of the Silk Road, it also made it easier for this deadly contagion to spread westward from its origin in western China or eastern Central Asia. And as a result, the world's second largest empire crumbled and fell. Now, careful, there were also other causes of the fall of the Yuan dynasty. By 1382, China, most notably, had thrown off the Yuan dynasty and replaced it with the Ming dynasty, but the plague was just one of the factors that weakened Mongol rule. It did, by the way, especially weaken the military because so many soldiers died. Heavy taxation and imperial corruption were also very significant, and there was the Red Turban Revolt, a peasant revolt, which was probably not unrelated to the plague, just as peasant revolts in Europe were, but was a more immediate cause of the downfall of the Yuan dynasty and the rise of the Ming dynasty. Okay, enough cause and effect. Good luck on your exam.